Now, unfortunately, there are no silver bullets when it comes to leadership. I'd love to be able to present some kind of unifying theory that can get us all through this, but it doesn't exist. And that's particularly the case when it comes to crisis leadership, as is exemplified by the situation we find ourselves in, thanks to this little guy, the COVID-19 virus. What we want to do instead, rather than looking for that silver bullet, is develop what Berkshire Hathaway's co-founder Charlie Munger referred to as a lattice work of models. Now, one of the first and most useful models is a thing called the triangle model. And this tells us that successful leadership outcomes are a result of the dynamic interplay between these three things: the leader, the environment, and the followers. Now let's have a look at a few of these. Environment first. Now clearly this is no longer a business as usual situation. The whole world is entering into a new normal. Even if you had a robust business continuity plan, even if you had a pandemic specific business continuity plan, the nature of this, the impact on the global world, international supply chains, all sorts of dependencies, means that we need to look at this in a novel way. Now, one of the most useful models that we can use to frame our thinking when we're talking about an environment like this is a thing called the Contagion framework. Now, this was developed by a Welsh knowledge management expert named Dave Snowden. Now, the two environments that are most pertinent for this situation are the complex and the chaotic environments. Now, complex environments are ones where there is no predictable, linear, repeatable relationship between cause and effect. Essentially, anytime we're dealing with human beings, we're in this world of complexity, particularly in crisis situations. We are not rational beings, less so when the pressure's on. Chaotic situations are ones where the rule book is thrown out the window, when we're facing novel, unprecedented, black swan type events. And you just have to look at the headlines in terms of what's happening around Australia and the world to recognise that there are definitely elements of chaos in what we're facing with the coronavirus pandemic. When we are facing a black swan event, a chaotic environment, Snowden advises that we need to be looking through a lens that says we're going to act, sense, and then respond. There is a real bias for action in dealing with a chaotic environment. The last thing we want to be doing is getting caught flat-footed and allowing the situation to overwhelm us. Not only does that mean we're not proactive in our response, but it also means that we're not instilling confidence in our followers, that we know what we're doing, that we have a plan, or we have any sort of control over the situation. Now, importantly, this bias for action doesn't mean knee-jerking our way into a response. We still need to think, but it does remind us that we do want to get back on that front foot as soon as possible. And if you look at the countries who have acted swiftly in this respect, places like Hong Kong and Singapore, we're seeing that they have had better results to date in this situation. But set against this backdrop, there is still a lot of complexity in what we're doing. And Snowden's recommendation for decision-making and sense-making out of these kind of situations is very instructive. He tells us we want to probe, sense, and respond in a complex environment. Now, probe is really important. What we're talking about here is essentially the conduct of experiments. If we're thinking about experimentation, instantly we're not wed to the plan. We're waiting for the environment to give us data back, but we are open to that data. We're going to collect it and we're going to modify our hypothesis throughout the process. Great example of this, a lot of organisations are going to split shifts and work from home models. We shouldn't be thinking of these as the solution. These are experiments. We need to be thinking of them as probes. We need to be collecting that data and constantly modifying. Now, let's talk about our followers. One of the most crucial things that the followers in any organisation are going to need in this uncertain and unsettling environment is information. We want to be, wherever we can, sharing information as widely and as transparently as possible. We're seeing some great examples of wiki-type pages, latest points of truth being put in a common single source of truth for the organisation. These kind of portals are fantastic as a means of sharing that information. The other thing we need to consider that when it comes to information is that message transmitted does not necessarily mean message received. We can't just fire and forget this either. A lot of times the message won't sink in the first time, and it may take constant reiteration and constant reassurance to ensure that our workforce is getting the message that we intend them for. Things like town hall meetings. Now, given the social distancing policies, maybe we're talking about this in a virtual sense, but having that access for our workforce to the senior leaders within the organisation is equally important. It will probably mean a bit of time that we need to spend. It will probably mean saying the same thing more than once, and it'll probably mean dealing with some fairly emotional and maybe a little bit of angst in terms of the questioning and the engagement. But this is necessary if we want to ensure that our followers have the reassurance that they're going to need in this unsettling time. A really great example of this from recent history is the case of Toll and Norsk Hydro. Now, both of these organisations suffered pretty devastating cyber attacks, but the way they handled them was markedly different. Norsk Hydro, they had webinars on a daily basis hosted by senior leaders for their clients to be able to approach them. Toll, on the other hand, haven't fared so well in that regard. There's been long periods where they haven't addressed the issue, either directly or through their social media, and they're facing customer backlash. Norsk Hydro, from all reports, hasn't lost a single key client as a result of the situation. Now, clearly, a time of crisis is a time that demands leadership. There is going to be an enormous requirement for management, so working out the processes and the methods of dealing with our workforce and our response to the situation, but there's an even greater requirement for leadership. And two of the key elements that we're going to want to see are presence and empathy. Now, in terms of presence, this amounts in a large part to a physical presence. Now, whether that is virtual or actually direct, depending on the social distancing requirements, people are going to want to see senior leaders dealing with this situation. But also, it's in the manner in which we carry ourselves. Emotional contagion is an important consideration. If we have the rot setting in, very negative attitudes, despair, concern, permeating throughout our organisation, it can be incredibly corrosive. If that rot is coming from the leader, then it's doubly so. Things like emotional regulation techniques can be incredibly important here. I'm a massive fan of box breathing. We used to call it combat breathing. These kind of things can be really important in terms of calming ourselves down and setting that right tone for the organisation. And this links to this concept of empathy. Our workforce, the whole world, is stressed and concerned about this situation. In many ways, it's not actually this little bug that's our problem, but it's the perceptual issues that arise out of the disease itself. And that's where our ability to have a little empathy for our workforce is going to be really important. It is okay to be transparent and authentic in this situation. While we want to lead with what a recent McKinsey article called bounded optimism and deliberate calm, we also want to be able to be human in this and share some of the concerns. But in the midst of this, we do want to be reassuring that we do have a policy, we do have programs, we do have plans to be able to work our way through it. The final consideration with empathy is towards yourself. Often there's an element of people going into hero mode, and already we're seeing a lot of executives working round the clock in the best interest to try and deal with this situation for their followers, for their organisation. This is fantastic, but we need to understand that this is not going to be over quickly. And therefore, the last thing we want to do is burn ourselves out in the first month, the first couple of weeks of this crisis. Look at this in the long run and look after yourself. If this means stepping back a little bit, prioritising things like sleep, like nutrition, like a bit of physical activity, not only will this help us in terms of our decision making and leadership, but it will also help us individually to give us the best chance of fighting this bug off at a personal level. So there you go. Hopefully that's provided a few models that we can add to our lattice work in an ability to provide some lenses through which we can view the situation presented by the coronavirus pandemic.